Okay, so the topic of this video are going to be some of the basic features of all life on Earth. So let's get started. Well, first of all, let's talk about, just what is biology. You're often going to hear biology is the study of life, but it's a little more complicated than that. Well, first of all, polar bears. Are polar bears a living organism studied within the realm of biology? And of course, the answer is yes. But what about flowers? Are flowers and plants a living organism that falls within the realm of biology? Yes. And then bacteria. Are bacteria living? Do they fall within the realm of biology? Yes, of course. But then it starts to get a little tricky. The sun. Is the sun alive? And hopefully the answer is no, the sun is not alive. And yet it falls within the realm of biology because it has a big impact on life. Water. Is water alive? No, not at all. But water is very much studied within the realm of biology because water has a big impact on life. DNA, is the molecule DNA alive? Again, molecules, no molecules are alive, but molecules like DNA are absolutely within the realm of biology because DNA happens to be a molecule that is really the foundation of life. Mountains. Are mountains a living? Of course not. Mountains are often just, big rocks pushed up through geologic processes. Are mountains a living? No, not at all. But they fall within the realm of biology because, again, life inhabits these mountains and depends upon them. So the study of life is, a little vague, but we hope to expand on that as we go through this. Well, moving forward here, life on Earth exists within a small range of our planet known as the biosphere. And when I look at this picture right here, I don't see anything labeled biosphere in the picture. So where is the biosphere? Well, if we zoom on in a little bit to the crust, what we're going to see, this picture shows nicely what the biosphere is. The biosphere ranges from the highest point above sea level, Mount Everest, to the deepest ocean trench, the Mariana Trench. And within that range is where life can be found, and this is what is called the biosphere. And so the biosphere is the layer where we find life. The layer of the Earth, and actually you could probably say the layer of the crust in the lower atmosphere where life exists. Okay, and what we can say about life on Earth is that it's incredibly diverse. There's over 2 million known species. When I look at this picture right here, I see that there are 6 big categories or kingdoms of life. Flowers are obviously a type of plant. A dog is a type of an animal. Mushrooms are a type of fungus. But then there's the other 3 kingdoms that might be a little less familiar to us. Amoebas and creatures that swim around in pond water are members of kingdom Protista. And then there's 2 kingdoms of bacteria. There are the eubacteria and there are the archaea or the archaebacteria. But there's an incredible diversity of life on Earth. And the pattern that we typically see is along the equator of the Earth is where, generally speaking, life tends to be more diverse. These areas are a little warmer, have more liquid water rained upon them, and so this is where we see the most diversity, within tropical rainforests. Well, within biology, we often study species, organisms that can create fertile offspring. The reason a man and a woman can typically create a child is because their DNA is almost identical to one another, about 99.9% identical. And so for that reason, we are able to reproduce and create fertile offspring. But what about a horse and a human? If they were to try to breed, would a centaur be birthed? And hopefully the answer is no, we're different species. And the reason we're not able to reproduce with one another is because the DNA of a human and the DNA of a horse are just too different. It's not compatible. Well, what about a chimpanzee? You might know that chimpanzees have a lot of DNA in common with humans, over 98%. Can we reproduce with each other? No. Even though our DNA is over 98% identical, it's just not similar enough. And so members of the same species, their DNA is compatible to the point where they can reproduce, and human and chimp just aren't. Well, one thing about life on Earth is that it's old. It's estimated that life on Earth goes back about 3.5 billion years ago in the form of bacteria. And so these rock formations called stromatolites, these are caused by mineral buildup from cyanobacteria, type of bacteria, and these are some of the oldest evidence of life on Earth. So science has identified that life on Earth goes back a pretty long time, 3.5 billion years old. And so let's talk about some characteristics. All life has a few common characteristics. Well, if we were in class, we'd talk to our neighbors and share some of our answers, but we're just going to go ahead and move forward. So one thing, all life is made from cells, or at least one cell. And so the cell is what we call the most basic unit of life that is capable of carrying on life processes. When I look at this picture, I can see that a cell has many internal parts. Why don't we call the nucleus the most basic unit of life? Or why don't we call a mitochondria the most basic unit of life? Why don't we call the Golgi body the most basic unit of life? Why is the overall cell the most basic? Well, that's because the cell is the most basic that can still carry on life. The individual internal parts just can't function on their own without the overall cell. And so what we've learned over the years is that cells have become specialized to perform various duties. These two pictures right here are fairly common to what you would find in a textbook. A plant cell that's square or rectangular, an animal cell that's kind of a roundish shape. These are very vague and general descriptions of cells. In reality, cells are very specialized and often have a shape that aids in their function. Now, for instance, here's red blood cells. These actually are roundish because they can roll without getting clogged in narrow veins and arteries as these cells are delivering oxygen throughout the body. But not all cells are round. You might know that neurons or nerve cells almost look like trees with branches and roots on them to better send electrical signals to and from the brain. Sperm cells have a long whip-like tail in order to swim and through the female reproductive system in order to transfer DNA and chromosomes to the next generation. Another characteristic that all life has is the requirement and the need of energy. Energy is the ability to do work and cause change. Well, here's a young lady who's about to eat a meal. And as she eats this hamburger, it goes into her stomach where it's eventually digested. And from the stomach, the food exits the stomach and moves into the small intestines. And from the small intestines, the food is broken down into G for glucose. And that glucose often gets transported to the liver, and the liver will often release that glucose all throughout our body as we go through our day. And this allows us to do our day-to-day activities. And so there's really two categories of energy users within biology. There are the autotrophs. Now, if you break the word auto and troph, prefix and suffix, auto means self, and troph means feeding. So these are organisms that can feed themselves. They feed themselves by doing photosynthesis. And so autotrophs perform photosynthesis. They create sugars. They create energy in the form of sugars from using sunlight. And so with some sunlight shining and with some rain falling, this plant will also take in some carbon dioxide from the air, and through the process of photosynthesis will give off oxygen into the sky, but more importantly for the plant, it creates C6H12O6. That's the formula for glucose, simple sugars such as glucose. And this is why plants do photosynthesis, because they're hungry and they're trying to make the glucose. And so when we think of photosynthetic organisms, we often think of plants, but they're not the only photosynthetic organisms on Earth. There's also algae, which is a type of protista, a member of kingdom Protista, and there's also the cyanobacteria. And so there's many organisms besides plants that are photosynthetic. So the second type of organisms, or category of organisms that use energy are the heterotrophs. Now we already know that troph means feeding, but hetero means different. These are organisms that feed themselves in a different way. And so probably the most obvious of the heterotrophs are the consumers. Those consumers that only eat meat, we call them carnivores. Those consumers that eat plants, we call them herbivores. And those consumers that will eat plants and meat, we call omnivores. And so heterotrophs, I should say consumers are one type of heterotroph. And then there are the heterotrophs that obtain their nutrients by feeding upon dead material. And these are the decomposers. Within the decomposer category, there's two different types of decomposers. A mushroom would represent the saprophytes. They absorb nutrients from dead organisms. They release enzymes to digest their whatever they're growing upon, and then they absorb the nutrients into their cells. And then a vulture might represent a good example of a detritivore. It actually ingests nutrients from dead organisms. Maybe this vulture didn't kill the skunk in the picture. Maybe it stumbled upon the dead skunk, but it will still ingest its flesh and muscle and obtain nutrients that way. Okay, so moving on, we're going to come to our third characteristic. Life responds to the environment. And because life responds to a stimulus, a factor that will produce some sort of reaction, heat, touch, heat, cold. These are things that are called a stimulus that cause us to respond in some way. Here we have a young woman with and someone sneaks up behind her and puts an ice cube on her shoulder. Almost instantly she's going to jump away and respond, perhaps verbally, that maybe she felt the coldness of that ice cube. How many times are we watching a scary movie and all of a sudden, boo, a monster appears on screen and the loud, startling music and noise appears, and that causes a stimulus, a response from us. And so we've responded to the environment, to the stimulus that we were provided. Well, as our body responds to the environment, our body tries to maintain a nice balance internally, and this is called homeostasis, the process where the body maintains a constant internal environment. Temperature of 98.6 degrees. That's probably the most obvious thing that our body works really hard to maintain. But our body also works to maintain the pH of our blood around 7.35, so a very, very weak base on the pH scale. And our body works really hard to maintain a small amount of blood sugar. And if any of these values stray too high or too low below normal, there could be some serious negative health effects. And so what our body does to maintain homeostasis is negative feedback. Most of the time, what our body does to maintain homeostasis is negative feedback. The process where your body is going to reverse a change that's happening. Now, before I go into some biology examples, let's look at an example of negative feedback in your house. Here's a layout of a small home. Somewhere in the middle of your house, you probably have a thermostat mounted on the wall, and this helps to control the temperature inside your house. And let's not forget you have the heating and air conditioning vents and ducts all behind the walls. And your thermostat is connected to your furnace by a wire. Well, let's say that you've set the thermostat to be 72 degrees. But right now it's really cold inside your house. It's 68 degrees. So what happens? Your thermostat will send a signal to your furnace. Your furnace will respond by producing heat and blowing heat throughout your home. And little by little, the heat will go to 69, 70, 71, and eventually back to the set point. And when that happens, your thermostat sends a signal to the furnace and the whole thing turns off. Negative feedback reversed the coldness and brought the temperature of your home back to normal. Well, that's what negative feedback does. Let's look at some biology examples now. So here we have a young child caught outside on a cold winter night. Now right now his core temperature is 98.6 degrees, but the longer he's exposed to cold, you can see his core temperature is dropping. He's getting colder and colder and colder. And you know what happens when you start to get too cold, you start to shiver. That uncontrollable shaking of your muscles, rubbing on other muscles, produces friction, and friction produces heat. And it's this heat that slowly begins to warm us closer to normal. And eventually we get back to normal and the shivering stops. But again, a great example of negative feedback because your body worked to reverse the change. The change was that this child was getting too cold, and your body worked to reverse that. Well, the opposite is true as well. Here we have a young lady at the beach and core temperature 98.6 degrees, but the longer you're exposed to the heat of the day, her body temperature increases and then gets hotter and gets hotter and gets hotter. And you know what happens if you get too warm. You start to sweat. You start to produce droplets of sweat all over your body. Well, how does this actually cool you off? As the sweat evaporates, heat is pulled away from your body, and eventually your temperature goes down. So the more you sweat, the more sweat will evaporate and pull heat away from your body. And the more you sweat, the sweat evaporates and it pulls heat away from your body, and eventually you're back to normal. Again, negative feedback reverses the change that was happening to you. Well, what about positive feedback? Positive feedback is a little more rare. Positive feedback will actually encourage or promote a change that's happening to your body. Well, before we go through a biological example, let's look at again an example of positive feedback in your home. Well, throughout your home, you have smoke alarms scattered in most rooms of your home. Let's say in the middle of the night, a fire breaks out in the corner of the room and you're sleeping so you don't even know it's happening. Well, one of the smoke alarms will begin to let off that loud, piercing noise. Now, look at the definition of positive feedback. Whatever change is happening is going to be promoted and encouraged. So, as this smoke alarm goes off, it will send a signal to all the other smoke alarms, and the alert is promoted. The alert is encouraged. And so this way you can see in this example, you can be woken up and you can get to safety. But positive feedback will encourage a change and promote it. Now let's go through some biological examples. So a great example of positive feedback are the muscle contractions that begin in a woman's uterus when she's about to give birth to a newborn child. These muscle contractions begin very slow at first, and then what happens, a signal gets sent to the woman's brain. The brain will respond by releasing a hormone. Now, ask yourself, if this was negative feedback, what would happen to the contractions? Look at the definition. Negative feedback would reverse this change. Do we want to reverse? Do we want to reverse and stop these contractions? If we were to do that, the baby would never be delivered. So in this case, positive feedback will encourage the change. Positive feedback will promote the muscle contractions. And so the hormones released actually cause the muscle contractions that speed up. So the baby will be delivered and birthed in a more timely manner. Okay, moving on, we come to another characteristic that all life shares, and that's the ability to reproduce and develop. Well, reproduction. Reproduction is simply passing on DNA, genetic material, from one generation to the next. We can break reproduction down to its most simplest form, and that's passing DNA to the next generation. Well, when we look at how life reproduces, well, those that reproduce sexually, inside of this sperm cell there is DNA from the male, and inside of this egg cell there is DNA from the female. And so sexual reproduction has figured out a way to combine DNA from the male with the female. But not every type of organism reproduces sexually. Some organisms, let's talk about the two types of reproduction. Some organisms reproduce asexually without another individual. Here we have an animation of a cell slowly dividing itself into two cells. And so when organisms reproduce asexually, they are genetically identical to one another. The offspring that are created are genetically identical to the parent. And so we basically have cloning by nature here. Examples of organisms that reproduce this way: bacteria, protista, and even some fungus and some plants and some animals. However, most fungus, plants, and animals reproduce sexually. But let's look at a quick example in animals. Here's an animal by the name of a hydra, and it's experiencing budding in the picture. You can see a new individual is growing off of the body of the parent, and eventually it'll pop off and float away in the ocean and asexually reproducing. And then there's sexual reproduction. And as we said earlier, this is where sperm cell from a male, egg cell from a female. And so in that sperm cell, there's DNA from the father, and in this egg cell, there is DNA from the mother. And so organisms that reproduce sexually produce offspring that is a genetic mixture of two parents. And so most fungus reproduce this way, most plants reproduce this way, and most animals, like the two insects that you see in the picture, reproduce sexually. Well, you might be asking, well, how does a plant, for example, how does a plant reproduce sexually? Well, here's two flowers, side by side in a forest, pretend. And on the flower to the left, the red dots represent pollen, which is the equivalent of male sperm. And on the right, that black dot you see there is the egg cell, the female part of the flower. Well, a bumblebee, for example, might buzz around feeding on nectar, and when it does, it gets pollen all over itself. And when it flies away, you can see the pollen is stuck to it. And eventually this bee might buzz around the neighboring plant, and by doing this accidentally transfers pollen. That's the act called pollination. Now, the sperm cell has to still grow all the way down to where the egg is, and that eventually does happen. But here we have the process where some plants will reproduce sexually. Okay, so we've gone over some characteristics of life. Well, now I want to ask you something. Is fire alive? If we're in class, we talk about this with our neighbor, but right now we're going to just move on. Is fire made of cells? No, not at all. Does fire require energy to burn? Yes, of course. Does fire respond differently to one environment versus another? Yes, fire behaves differently in various environments. Can a fire reproduce? I would argue yes, asexually. If a fire is burning and a spark were to jump and land somewhere else, it might spark a second fire. Can fire grow and develop? I would say yes. A forest fire doesn't begin out of control. Forest fires might begin, when somebody throws a cigarette out of their car, and it slowly grows and develops into a pretty big fire. So is fire alive? Well, I hope you know the answer to this question is no, of course not. Fire is not a living organism, but it does possess some of the qualities of life. Well, let's look at something else. Something that should be a little more obvious. Is a car alive? Well, is a car made of cells? Parts of it, you could argue, yes. leather interior and the cloth interior of a car, maybe the wood paneling. Some cars have wood on them. So you could say that parts of cars are made from cells. Does a car require energy? Yes, of course. Will a car respond to its environment? Well, it depends upon the car. Some cars with advanced technology will respond to, dry and sun and wetness of the road. Can a car reproduce? No, not at all. Can a car grow and develop? Well, no. Humans have developed cars and built them and assembled them. So, are cars alive? You can see that cars do have some qualities of life. Are cars living? Of course not. No, not at all. But I hope you see the point I'm making with the fire example and the car example. There's a lot of objects that will possess some of these qualities of life. But in order to be considered living, we think we have a pretty good checklist here of what it means to be alive. So as we wrap up this video, if you're in my bio class, try to answer these questions on a separate sheet of paper, and I'm happy to check your answers before school or after school one day. Hope you found this video helpful. Thanks for watching.